Sup Shredders, my name is Logan aka Spiderhands and welcome to an SP Reacts, where today we've got the latest EP, I presume, from an act named MaeBeaNot, titled Involuntary Recollections. And if we switch over to here, we've got ourselves the EP on the screen on Bandcamp. We will be checking out the YouTube links for each of these 6 tracks, but it's got the album art nice and big on the screen. I should know that I've previously reviewed quite a bit of material from MaeBeaNot in the past, including the track Can't Change, as well as the Disjointed and Mangled EP, as well as others. And so we're going to listen through each of these tracks and we're going to hear what we think. Started with Finally Leaving, let's go. It's interesting with the fizz in the piano. Great use of panning with those steps. So that was the first track, the intro to the CP, Involuntary Recollections, the track titled Finally Leaving. In each of these post-track sections, I'm going to provide an overall song analysis of everything from lyrics and vocals all the way through to studio production, as well as any applicable constructive critique, and then finally my general thoughts from a listener's perspective. But first of all, what do we think this track is about? I would say Finally Leaving, relatively minimalist as it is and with no vocals whatsoever. From the sounds of the knocking, the door opening there, the sound of the car driving off, and then walking across the stereo field to the right there, it heavily insinuates something similar to the title, in that we are finally leaving and going somewhere. And you wonder where they're going, and immediately it's just very different to a lot of music that I review personally as a music reviewer, because it's not vocal focused. And this is something that's very consistent with a lot of MaeBeaNot's music, is that they try to create these environments and atmospheres there that's quite holistic in its approach without needing to have too much literally going on with the storytelling. I think that the use of the Foley of the knocking and the door opening and the driving off and everything like that was done quite well. Relatively atmospheric, especially with the kind of hiss or the kind of rain that was maybe going on at the start of the track alongside that very pensive piano playing. And you can very easily kind of like ascertain the direction and approach of it, tell a story from that alone. The Foley, in the sequence of it, becomes a lead event in a way that I haven't really heard of a lot of across my time doing these videos. And I just think, again, it's just using the rain as a musical instrument, the texture of that with the consistency of its unison note almost as a non-judgmental companion to those keys. Because there's a very pretty line going beyond there with the flickers on the right hand navigating between some interesting sort of like major leaning stuff. Not the whole time, it goes between major and minor keys there and kind of legatos and does some sort of grace notey kind of twists and stuff with the keys. And it's not chromatic, it does navigate through triads, but it's almost like it sounds like we're tapping around and finding our place in the world with this instrument there until we get that knocking and we know that we have to do something different. And then you have no more music after the keys navigate and play that little intro solo there. It's almost like we're letting the listener know that, for example, without the piano, we wouldn't know that this is potentially an EP or an album. So to have the piano there kind of insinuates that we are going to have more music later on. And that allows us to sit through the footsteps and everything like that, knowing this is potentially the shortest track in the EP, understanding that it's just setting the scene for the big adventure we're about to go on across these 6 songs. But the through composed nature of it structurally, I think, is compelling there, primarily because the journey still makes sense. It's not random or discordant or discombobulating. And ultimately, again, I think it just puts MaeBeaNot in an interesting position there of being quite a different experimental sort of like noise related musician, as opposed to trying to direct too hard, thematically at the very least. with any sort of like main sort of chord progressions, melodies, or harmonies. I do like, just as a closing note, how the keys simplify a bit towards the end, but there's just so much that goes on in this first minute that even if you aren't necessarily a fan of this kind of music, you can still kind of sit with it and try and sort of vibe it out. But yeah, honestly, like outside of there not really being much of a musical theme, because it's more sort of almost like a conversation, I suppose, a flurry of different messages there through the notes, maybe intersecting or interacting with each other between the hands. You have an almost ambivalent, ambiguous feel to the piece. And the studio recording, mixing, and mastering is tight in part because it's not, like, because the Foley is integrated really neatly alongside the reindeer, alongside the car engines, the use of the heels on the floor there. You can vividly imagine what's going on within this. The way that the pan automates towards the right as the person steps across. The fact that things aren't predictable in their interpretation or approach there, so it is more sort of exciting in part because of that. But ultimately, you just have a really sensational piece that doesn't overstay its welcome. And it leads us into gazing at nothing yet. It stares, which is track number 2 for today. Just a great start proceedings. And immediately a vibe shift. Highly unsettling, mind you. That is quite intense. That is quite loud. It's incredible sound design, the way that it oscillates like that. The staging it does there to get it to work like that. We have an intricate understanding of that synthesis. Yeah, just the playing around with resonances and the frequency spectrum is interesting. Oh, they've gotten good at that as well. It writhes. I mean, I gotta hand it to MaeBeaNot. I listened to a little bit of experimental kind of ambient music like this before, not and outside of MaeBeaNot's work as well, and they do this very well. When it's more sort of straightforward and there's this sort of Foley as a focus, and it's more sort of like about the actual sound and intensity of the notes, how pervasive they are in the middle of the low range as per gazing at nothing yet it stares. To me, this track kind of sounds like it's someone looking into the void and it's staring back, and you kind of look away a little bit, and then you don't necessarily have to deal with how much you can feel it kind of seething in rage at you for some reason. Then as you look further into the abyss, it stares back and it's just overwhelming. And it's an incredibly, I mean, I say visceral a lot of the time, and I mean it every time, but there's just something that is so antithetical to a gentle listening experience hearing this. You just have this sharp kind of these different notes there that are deliberately kind of perky, and they kind of stab at your eardrums a little bit with the way that they resonate. And we change the feeling of them, the intensity of some of those resonant frequencies in a way where it's clearly an approach that MaeBeaNot is looking for. Just the way that they know to fade it in with that that harmony there, but it just kind of sounds like a sine wave that's just trying to catch your attention a little bit too much. And as you kind of come down from that height, with everything kind of becoming more sort of low mid oriented, you then start to have this warble, this vibration there, this rustle, and it kind of stems and sort of trips over itself there, and it becomes almost like this automaton that is whirling in place, getting closer and closer to you, until that point around the 50-second mark where if you're not paying close enough attention, you're the frog in the pot getting boiled by it, and it's just it's eviscerating you. It's like understandable from like a fundamental, I understand what they're doing to make those sounds, but it's knowing how to build them, how to play with the waveforms, how to play with the volume and intensity of certain elements there to do like literal sound design. Like, I have no doubt in my mind that they could definitely do like soundtracks for horror films and stuff like that, but just the way that it comes back after that and goes wah again, like they're aware that even in a track where there is some interesting stuff going on there that's different to the first, that is a 4-minute piece, so without a main sort of vocal layer or lead, with less direction than the previous track, which had quite a lot for a minute, you're effectively left to sort of like kind of climb the mountain that is gazing at nothing yet it stares, to go through its peaks and troughs. And as you feel the music kind of rumbling in the low end there, and if you have headphones that are sympathetic towards it, or even not like mine are not super sympathetic to bass, you do still kind of hear the sub frequencies, and I do wonder whether we're playing within that 30 hertz range. This is not an unusual thing again with MaeBeaNot's music. I've heard music of theirs where they do this, and so they've clearly polished and perfected the art of that feeling of discomfort that they're trying to portray for their music without being too literal or blunt about it. But just as you go into that final build around the 3-minute 20 mark there, you're like, oh crap, we're doing this again, and it's like, oh, we're rising. And then before it gets too much, at the end of the track it peters out, fades out over 2 seconds, and you're kind of wondering what just occurred. It like makes sense from a through composed perspective because it's more of an experience as opposed to trying to be a song. At the same time, you kind of wonder how we got to this place from the previous track. Is that person walking? Have they gotten to a place where these feelings hit them like this? Have they stopped walking in order to be able to take this in? And these massive sort of like tails and sides to some of these synth or bass patterns there, they resonate around the stereo field. So it sounds massive. But because of the way the effects change and the frequencies are adjusted, you feel smaller and bigger, and it kind of writhes. And when you add those LFO parts, such as around the 50-second mark, wow, it's just kind of a surreal experience, but nonetheless incredibly musically interesting, especially considering how minimalist it is. It doesn't have a whole lot of instrumental layers. I assume that it's like an acoustic, like an analog synthesizer that they're literally shifting up and down and messing with in real time. And I adore the sound design in general. Again, I was never disinterested. It's almost like because you know it's going at you, you want to sort of like understand it more and hear more of it out, because at least you know the music cares about what you think about it. Thematically, it's diminished. I mean, like, there's a flat 5 triad in there, I think, for that main sort of intro chord there, and it's just repugnant, but like in a way where if we think about what the subject matter of the title is discussing, it makes complete sense. And then from a studio master, recording, mixing, and mastering perspective, it's nice and loud what it needs to. I didn't mention this with Finally Leaving. Both Finally Leaving and Gazing at Nothing Yet, its stereos have fantastic dynamic range, great difference in range between the quiet and louds. Part of the reason why the most like heavy parts of this track are so impactful is because they can also be so quiet. So I just think that's testament to MaeBeaNot's expertise in this part. They definitely know what they're doing. And it's just the sound design, the fact that they also, just as a closing comment, use resonant frequencies cleverly. Because often the aim is not to have those. We want a nice, clean sounding mix that has a sense of some sort of balance to it. But either whether it's a symmetry within the panning perspective or resonances within the frequency spectrum, there are things you can do to switch things up when required in order to get an affectation to the listener that is different from like a comfortable listening experience. And we're aware of that, so it's really good. Everything Disappears Except Harmonies, track number 3.
I sit and cry and hope and pray and die in my solitude.
Phenomenal vocals. Not altogether surprised, but that initial part was beautiful. So you've slowed that down, and you've still got the existing piano melodies or harmonies from the other one. Because if it was part of the initial composition, the piano would be low tuned as well. I genuinely enjoyed this track. Like, it's so short. Like, this is the first track today I've been like, well, to be fair, the second one was like that as well. First one was like that, should I say. The second one was pretty intense. This track I primarily dig because it features a vocal layer at the start where it's kind of pristine in its original form, at least for a moment. And when you've got the title of Everything Disappears Except Harmonies, it kind of makes sense that the voice would go away, but then you'd keep some of those chords in there from the piano parts and stuff like that. It's just an easy sort of connection between the two with the vocals, being a melody. You have the singer kind of going down, getting like kind of trodden on in terms of their pitch there until they become sort of mutated and just kind of like horrific sounding. The dreams turn into a nightmare, so to speak, like a fever dream, so to speak. So they talk about, like sitting, crying and praying in their solitude effectively. I think I missed the part after that word before the solitude part, and then you just get that. And then just things like fade out. It's just Like you could imagine having a dream where you had those kind of vocals come in and there things just start darkening and twisting and writhing and stuff like that. I can imagine that. So I think maybe, you know, after we left, maybe we were in a moment of stasis where we didn't necessarily, or couldn't necessarily face a lot of those things that were staring back at us. And then the moment that we come to terms with that and try to stare back into it, the experience we have is maybe that music is the only thing that kind of gets me through this sort of like feeling or experience that I'm having, if that makes sense. Involuntary recollections, not being able to stop remembering how lonely we are, but knowing that in order to sort of communicate things, the music is that important to us. I mean, if that's the kind of direction that we're going with this, I just want to say it's been really like genuinely a privilege to be able to listen to this music for a couple of reasons. One, because MaeBeaNot's music, and I'm not glazing because I feel obligated to. It's very interesting stuff, like genuinely. But also, I appreciate that we have musicians, you know, now more important than ever, putting their heart out in their music and really sort of expressing themselves, not just authentically, but also in very creatively interesting ways there. Just having it end in solitude without any sort of like attempt to sort of resolve it in terms of the storytelling. You're just like, oh, okay, they're sitting there and crying. And usually with those kind of verses or tracks there, those kind of slower tracks, they would go somewhere or maybe kind of discuss so further and, you know, like articulate things. Maybe they would add perverted context as they go through the piece, but you never get that. It just goes into the solitude. You are just left alone with a sort of malformed, lower pitched vocals there, as you get occasional glimmers of other instrumental layers around that. Like it just becomes kind of wretched sounding, but in a way where it makes sense considering the subject matter that we've had beforehand. When you understand the overall context, it works much better, I think, as a whole. So I think even though it's through composed, we have a fantastic start that is different to other parts of this record so far. I think having clear vocals here is something that we haven't really had much, and MaeBeaNot's music either. So it's good to just try something different. And to have the brushes in the background kind of reminds you, maybe even the music from like The Shining, you know, that movie or something like that. That old school kind of lounge there, that kind of slow, kind of like withering away and sort of like drowning on our sorrows kind of aesthetic. Whilst like the double bass and the brushes go in the background there, the double bass dancing around it. You've got those jazzy keys in the upper range twinkling away in the sky in a way that kind of reminds me like a tiny bit of Final Leaving, but with a sense of sophistication there to an extent where you can imagine this person working through this and then the walls melting around them. I just think it's kind of nice to have the keys in the double bass and those brushes present this sort of jazzy aesthetic in a way where it presents a style of music where people would maybe go through these feelings of loneliness and trying to figure out how to get out of it, but maybe might not be able to do that. And as you get things lower and lower tuned due to them like slowing down the samples to change the pitch of them, kind of like a vinyl record playing at a slower speed, you get these kind of ethereal, kind of wistful sounding tones in amongst some of the more sort of like unsettling bits there. You have a complication in the sense that it's like a similar track to what we had earlier, but with a lot of the glow of the vocalist removed, it becomes kind of depressing. There's like a melancholic feel to some of the brass that comes in around like the 1:40 mark, for example. And you do get elements of other parts of the track to come in and sort of resonate there in a way that's very gentle. So it's not completely sad or anything like that. It's not even necessarily that scary, but it's just more like the drums, because of how slow the percussion's been sampled at that stage, almost sounds like a ticking clock. And so it seems like we're counting down to something, which is kind of surreal. Almost like we're reversing these takes, going back in time to something to try and figure out how we got there. And as we kind of fade out there, you hear a little bit of the original theme there, but a lot of the kind of energy is gone at that stage there. You're not really sure what to make of it. You feel a bit confused and sort of disoriented. And I think that's exactly the mood that they're going for with this. It was the first track where we've had a dedicated like, oh, this is a more sort of like contemporary, like not contemporary, but like more sort of like easy to follow structure instrumentally in terms of layers and stuff like that. And MaeBeaNot immediately takes that away because that's not the point. Thematically, it's like a very sort of chilled out kind of extended major for some of the main sort of harmonies that we have there. Even with the kind of malforming of things and the way we sort of like twist those pitches around and stuff like that, it still works out to be a resolute kind of very gentle jazzy seventh overall there, a bit of emotional sophistication in there. It's got a sense of warmth through the emphasis on the mid-range even when we do get rid of the brighter components. And even though things sound kind of twisted with those reverse takes of the kit and stuff like that, you still nonetheless appreciate what they're trying to accomplish here in terms of providing a track where at minor it might have been a bit too sort of like easy to have just made it sad sounding. It's almost like we're trying to find balance within our sadness here. But yeah, this is an interesting piece here. I think at 2 minutes 30, it definitely doesn't overstay its welcome. It's quite a sort of like fascinating structure there with the sung intro and the way that it kind of degrades over time. Studio recording, mixing and mastering, I just think the reverse takes and the percussion at the end, as well as the way that those sort of more vintage textures from the vocals, bass, piano and drums where the brushes are presented was quite nice. The way sort of pitch shift and adjust the feel and scope and speed of things to change and warp the vibe of it was really cool. And there's just some interesting production decisions made between, again, those warped sort of like more kind of low-key elements versus, again, the piano that's presented relatively normally. It's like we're going between those two there, going between the old and the new. And you have other vocal takes in the background as well, which just is a close, like the sub-layering of it. There's just a lot of nuance and dimensionality to the mix in this one, where it's far more complicated than the previous track, Gazing at Nothing Yet It Stares, in a way that kind of elevates it, but they still feel like equal tracks and they still feel part of the same record. Just the studio production leveling in general is very good, and I'm really happy with the way that we produced the vocals here, the way that we had them as mains and sort of like subs. I do maybe think that maybe we're reversing most of the takes actually around that late part there, which is why it sounds very sort of trippy sounding. And if that's the case, then that's just really cool. It's a really cool creative decision there. But yeah, no, it does get pretty sort of feral around the 1 minute 07 with some of those lower tune kind of vocal takes there. And we're at the halfway point now. I'm not sure where we're going with this. Maybe this is a track we didn't want to remember. Maybe this is a subject maybe we didn't want to remember. We've got Heavy Regrets looming, track number 4. More brass. We're just leaving the brass there for now, going into the echo cave. That buzz in the low end. The helicopter. Birds. That's actually outside, not in the song. The neighbors across the road have got seagulls, and sometimes they're very loud. So that was Heavy Regrets Looming, track number 4 for today off of this EP, or this record. You have the brass come back in from the previous track with a nice sort of flourish that's still very low key because of the lo-fi processing there, the filtering at the high end to it. And we sort of separate ourselves from that almost immediately. It brings us into a new environment like we've stepped into it. But then we immediately get this track where just the droning alone of certain elements there kind of does sound like it's about to sort of go on top of you. And the kind of thumping that you have as you go through that is just kind of tense. And it's like, okay, why are we being quite aggressive with the percussion through that brass part? And so effectively, I think once you get out of that ecosphere, you've gone into a situation where the track is letting you know there is a lot of darkness ready for you, and you'd better kind of be ready to cope with it. And I assume that that's more related to the journey that, or the involuntary recollections that MaeBeaNot is having through the space. Because what's kind of wild is just how we have the harmony and melody from the previous one, and we talk about everything disappears except the harmony, but then now at this point with the regrets looming, we've even forgotten about the harmony. And it's just that kind of wind turbine that we're stuck in that we're hearing now for a lot of that past the brass. You have occasional kind of thumps of the kicks and stuff like that, and you have like twangs of a steel string guitar that's been heavily effects chain modulated. It's just these different sort of tones and textures are presented in ways where it's sort of unreal and otherworldly. And like you have some of those tricks that we had in Gazing at Nothing, Yet It Stares, where, you know, like around that 140 mark, we do have that gradual build of the ferocity and velocity of things. But it's done in a way where it's maybe trying to be a little bit less abrasive than the previous one with that sort of like diminished sort of like synth kind of rubbing up against you. It's like the constant thump of what's going on underneath is compelling in the sense that it grounds you and helps to split it up. But as you go into a note around the 2-minute 40 mark, you just can't help but thinking, okay, I've had this drone, I've had this rumble for a lot of this piece. How is it going to resolve? And as you kind of feel it sort of form another alternate to the noisy parts you've had earlier, you kind of wonder what those regrets that you were feeling were meant to be. What are we doing here? You have this note, this unison note that kind of goes boom, boom. You have like an octave going on there or something like that, a very subtle octave on the higher end there. And it's like, it's almost tame in comparison to a lot of other stuff we've had prior to this. But just, it almost sounds like a cat purr when you have the brum, brum around like the 1-minute 30 mark, for example. And it's like you're sitting with those regrets once the music goes away. And you're just left with the darkness, and with those noisy parts that I discussed there, with less notes involved or chords or bass lines involved, it's going back to a similar sort of prospect to maybe even track number 1 or like more to number 1 or sometimes even like number 2, where we had a respite with 3, but it's almost like more to test you as opposed to help you have a positive listening experience. We do go between certain notes and stuff like that, don't get me wrong. We have these notes that we sort of harmonize and try to resonate with through that midsection. It's just that it's far more subtle and less eloquent than the previous track. But it just fades out at the end as well. So you kind of wonder whether the music fading out is actually the things not looming over the person anymore. Maybe we kind of had the blimp fly over us, drop what we needed, and now we're kind of sitting with those things. I'm not quite sure. But like thematically, it has that major landing at the start there with the brass parts, but then it kind of goes into like a kind of a weird Phrygian mode with a flat second there, going with the dun dun, and then it's just no notes at all, really. Oh no, to be fair, there are notes. They're just more like either deliberately slow staged core notes that are meant to dictate a direction there, or they're more just trying to make them more compelling by adding a note, even if that's not really the point. But I do dig the production regardless there, the way that they managed to get the sound of it going like that, and like that's a wind, like a noise texture I suppose, and a synthesizer. Boom. They had like an octave apart as well, I think, in the lows and light low mids, almost like they're buzzing away waiting for their chance to snap. Yeah, honestly interesting in the way it's been through composed and non-predictable. Studio recording, mixing and mastering. Again, it was great how we filtered the brass and other elements at the start there. The seamless transition from the coloration that we had at that point to the wind turbine was also pretty effective and slick there. And so ultimately you just have this kind of dynamic range to this record as well that allows us to go from quiets to like louds and stuff like that, and allow the music to sit and kind of give us a hint in order to what's to come. Music surrounds you in the headphones. There are resonant frequencies there as part of this music, but they're usually deliberate and sort of like attentive to what the music might need. And it's nice and loud, bit of pumping with those like interesting sort of like kind of quirky produced kicks there in the low, and the kind of dull thud there. Bass compression limiting is handled. They sound like they're almost sort of like delaying themselves. Drum, drum there. Like we have those are slowed down samples. It's very cool stuff. It'd be interesting to know more about the production process of this music. I'd say it would be quite intricate. But we have track number 5, Rotten Memories Forgotten. Use of the ticking there. Is that an instrument or a Foley thing? I went doing the lock. I'm trying to figure out whether we're unlocking the memories to take them away or store them up again so they can't be found. That was interesting. I'm not really sure to make of Rotted Memories Forgotten. I think after Heavy Regrets Looming, because of the way that things vibrated and oscillated, you could kind of understand how things were coming closer to you there. Especially as the music had that initial sort of like brass sort of jazz set up in the previous track, and then presented an entirely different sort of like atmosphere for you to be hearing. Rotted Memories Forgotten with a lack of vocals ultimately I think comes down to like the sounds of like picking a lock or opening doors or something along those lines. I'm still kind of deciding whether or not it's related to unlocking the doors, or unlocking the locks, or getting further into them. I think part of the ambiguity is that a lack of structure to this piece leaves it through composed as per the previous tracks. But because you kind of come back to the occasional ticking, it's almost like you can imagine as someone there within the abyss kind of pecking it away a little bit, and then like taking a moment to kind of reconfigure and then trying it again in slightly different patterns. You're not sure if we find a resolution near the end, I'm not quite sure, but regardless, it's still kind of, yeah, it's just continuously unpredictable. And amongst those kind of ticking sounds that kind of form the focus of the lead in a similar way to the tapping and knocking that you had in the first track, Finally Leaving, you have this synthesizer in the background that almost sounds like a machine that's starting to start up and then kind of whirs back down again. It kind of pervades that kind of interferes with the kind of concentration on the clicking and everything like that, because it seems almost like something is about to explode or power up in a way that is not desirable. And as you add further kind of noise textures there to add a bit of hiss and kind of a more sort of feral, less kind of like clean sort of like tonality to things than you already had, you're left in a position where you sort of feel uncertain, a sense of dread almost. You have like further ticking and little kind of like wop wop and other sort of like notes, bits of ambience, and there are sub layers and bits of air candy in there to kind of help put things together. But as you kind of have additional kind of like pulsing, writhing elements come in and out there with the fuzziness that again indicates a fundamental understanding of how synthesizers work, you're just not really sure what to make of it there. It's almost like those rotted memories. They're trying to come back to the surface, but we're not really sure how to shove them back down. As we occasionally have like these pick slides going, wow, there as things kind of glide over the frequency spectrum. You're left with like the last minute of the track there after all that, which is the machine being a bit more sort of consistent with its approach there as you storm forward. And as you have another final attempt or two at trying to unclick the lock there, things start to come to a close eventually. Admittedly, it is quite a long 2 minutes 42, not because the track is poorly produced or unpleasant, but simply because you're sitting there with a sense of trepidation going, what's going to occur? Where are we headed with this? There are some tracks with abject, you can clearly understand how the title connects with the music, such as, again, Everything Disappears except Harmonies. With this song, it's more like, again, there's multiple ways you can interpret it. But with that kind of synth there in the upper register there near the end there kind of fading us out, you're left in a position where with just one song to go, you're not really sure where MaeBeaNot's journey is headed. And I think that kind of like ambiguity makes for, I think that's been something that's more of a theme through the entire record so far, to be fair. Nonetheless, there with a focus more on noise as opposed to predominance like melodies or harmonies there, with arguably a harmony in the background with the way that a lot of those kind of whole notes or held notes kind of coalesce and coagulate. You leave this track with an experience that is sort of surreal, with a theme that is like non-existent. It's not trying to be a major track, it's not trying to be a minor track, it's trying to create an atmosphere, like an environment that sounds empty almost there, apart from the clicking, apart from those machine sounds that you have there. And it's a very sort of different way of writing music to what I'm used to and what I got taught. But I do dig the fact that we have musicians like MaeBeaNot trying different things there. Again, adding the occasional sort of like clicking and sort of like popping of things to try and get into that place. And the cool thing about it as well, before I suppose we move on to the last track, is that it could also be something else entirely differently, like a latch opening and closing, almost like we're trying to get into doors or something like that. I'm not quite sure. Regardless, it is intriguing. And I think in general, the polish across this track from a studio production, recording, mixing, and mastering perspective is very, very good. There's no issues with resonance where it would not be expected. The leveling in general is tight. And when things are more sort of like violent or like intense, that, you know, like you definitely feel it. You feel the sense of how deliberate it is in a way that does not confuse you. We've got Finally Longing for Days That Never Came, track number 6. We're back to the rain. Full circle. Those are vocals from track 3. Wind as well, you know. The vocal line that you can hear as a sublead is very pretty. I'm gonna assume that's a vocal layer, it could be strings. I did like the bird sounds when they were there. Oh, crazy. And that, like, just going back really quickly, that's a deliberate sound design decision to have things that wide in the stereo field. That's very clever. I like that a lot. That was neat. So that was Looking or Longing for Days That Never Came, track number 6. Is a song where effectively you feel like with the journey we've had throughout the CP as a whole so far, maybe we left and then after finally leaving, we realized that we still didn't find what we wanted to. And the innate sadness of the vocal melodies that we have as like chops within this piece in the background are effectively the person mourning the loss of that, even as the birds tweet in the sky, and there's a sense of nature, how it's healing, outside of that, which is an interesting take on it, primarily because it almost insinuates that the stuff that we've been going to has been in real life and we've been trapped in our mind up until that point. Like we've been taken out of our reality by these involuntary recollections, which I as someone who can relate to suddenly remembering things that I don't want to, like either through triggers or otherwise, I think that's it's relatable. But I think what's so cool about this, outside of the minimalist melodies that do harmonize neatly with surrounding elements there vocally, with the heavy effects processing on them, they might not be vocals, but I think they are. You've just got the rain in this through composed piece. You've got the rain from the start to kind of help tie everything together. It's so important for like an EP to feel like it's connected. Otherwise, you could just release 6 singles, you know what I mean? And as you have those kind of rustling, rumbling bass synths in the lower area there, it adds a menace of some of the other tracks you've had through the CP as well. It's almost like a culmination of a lot of these kind of ideas that we've had so far coming to a close. And if you have the bells as well, tolling for thee there, the boom, that sort of like pitch in the ether there. I mean, it's just like the way that the vocals come in by the 30-second mark. You've got a full sounding composition, even though it's very unorthodox, I suppose, in comparison to the way that a lot of people make music. The way that the rain is so dominant in the mix, because that is what's kind of drowning out everything potentially, or that's what we're coming back into. Maybe we have been dreaming after walking away and we've come back to reality and it is a stormy night, and then the rain goes away and then you hear the birds. Like the sun's come up after that, I'm not quite sure. With the kind of wall in the foreground there, and that continuing with some of the bird parts there, it's almost like some of the darkness exudes beyond the sleep that we've had, but like it becomes less intense as we go along. To be fair, it actually does. The bass continues the entire time, which actually, considering the longing for days that never came, we're not going to get a happy ending out of this. With like the pads in the foreground, around like the 1 minute 45 mark, for example, there you're effectively just left with these kind of discordant like layers that are kind of forced to intermingle. You're left with these kind of disparate layers that are forced to sort of intermingle and amalgamate in a way where, because of the production quality, it does make sense, but it's still nonetheless unsettling. You've got like heavy resonances of sub bass, such as around the 2 minute mark and stuff like that. We're still adding those elements there to affect the listener. But as we kind of like have those bird sounds come in a higher register there, we maybe come out of the depths of that. Until we're kind of left to sort of sit there with things being more sort of like clear-headed, but also not in a desirable position. I'm going to be thinking about this track for the rest of the day. But it's really kind of fascinating that we've just, within this track, we managed to sort of put through a lot of what we had previously, like the wind sounds and stuff like that as well, around like the 45-second mark. Just, it's all coming together. And it does kind of run to a conclusion of sorts, even if it's not necessarily a desirable one. Like ideally you'd want the people in the story to potentially find a sense of sort of comfort and peace but it just doesn't seem to be the case, even though things are quieter than they were before. It's like a bittersweet thing, even though perfection, I guess, is the enemy of good. But I also am kind of like 50-50 on whether the vocals come from Everything Disappears or not. Regardless, it's still neat. And I think as a through composed piece, tying things together there, it ends again on that kind of melancholic note, but is nonetheless effective because there is more of a journey you go through with the way the things are staircased subtly over time. Thematically, it's minor leaning there. I would say there's probably a minor key orient there, despite how some of the other notes might try to pick things up in a way that's, you know, like maybe like unexpected. And I think considering the subject matter with that main sort of root note resonating for the vast majority of the piece there, it makes total sense that you would have it be sad sounding. This is clearly not a desirable situation for MaeBeaNot to be in. I think that's something that's been sort of like communicated across this very sort of like indirectly, vocally at the very least. But then we are very blunt, to be fair, with Everything Disappears. Ultimately, studio recording, mixing and mastering wise, I just think it's a very sort of smooth sounding track. That despite again how experimental, almost like kind of avant-garde it is, it makes sense when you've heard enough of it and when you've heard the rest of this track, you know, the rest of these tracks. So ultimately, I'm quite happy with it, even though I'm sad that they're going through this. And again, for days that never came longing, you're not going to find your sort of like happiness there. At best, it is going to be melancholic. So ultimately, yeah, nice and loud. Bit of pumping, deliberate, sort of like resonant frequencies in certain areas to sort of invoke discomfort there, but also great use of Foley with the bird sounds, as well as the vocal sort of effects change and stuff like that being kind of modulated like that. And we're going to talk about these tracks more in the conclusion. Guys, welcome to the conclusion of my review of the EP from an act named MaeBeaNot, titled Involuntary Recollections. I'm not sure if it's an EP or an album. I think if it's less than 7, it's an EP, and if it's more than 7, it's an album. I could be wrong. I'm going to name it as an EP, but let me know if I'm incorrect. In this section, we're going to provide an overall analysis of these tracks, everything from lyrics and vocals all the way through to studio production, as well as any applicable constructive critique, and then finally my general thoughts from a listener's perspective. But first of all, what do we think this record is about? Ultimately, I think this is about MaeBeaNot discussing the varying ways in which they struggle with their head coming in to kind of mess with them. The start kind of, you know, messing around on the piano and finally leaving, coming to a point where they knock at things and go on their own sort of journey with the heels, eventually getting to a point on longing for days that never came, to where after all the kind of like positions we've been in and the kind of moments of kind of being more sort of like forward and clear with our communications, even then it kind of comes down as per track 3. So you're just left with the feeling of, even though they're aware of what's around them, they're aware of the nature and the birds and everything like that, the rain still persists, or maybe the rain goes away and they're just kind of left with the nothingness. I'm not quite sure. Regardless, it is open to interpretation. Part of it is that there are very few clear words in this. Like track number 3 is very straightforward with its approach vocally with the lady with phenomenal vocal technique. I'm not sure if it's actually someone, if it's MaeBeaNot or someone I know singing there, but I adore the tone of it and the way that you've got those more sort of like traditional sort of like vintage double bass sort of like brush and brass elements there and the keys as well twinkling along. And we do have some, like, I do like the keys finally leaving as well, the way they present themselves. I think as well the synthesizer sound design that we have in certain elements here where they kind of add stack octaves or add diminished such as and gazing at nothing, and the way that they deliberately boost the sub bass to make you feel a bit kind of like overwhelmed, or kind of just automate the volume of certain elements there. But not just from a post-production perspective, from like a compositional perspective, literally changing the feel and interpretation of music as you go along. It's a track where, because of the Foley, because of the sounds of like the knocking and like the kind of clicking of things and such as rotted memories, you've got to kind of pick up the pieces based on that. It's not going to hold your hand, and that's something that's consistent with MaeBeaNot's music. I don't mind it. I'm not saying this will necessarily be music for everyone, but for people that want to sit there and kind of go on an adventure where they can imagine what's going on, this is probably more one of those experiences. Regardless, it's incredibly intense music when it wants to be, but I also feel there are some moments, some really wonderful moments there where, especially in Everything Disappears and even the start of Who Regrets Learning, you just had the brass being very sort of like low-key with the lo-fi sort of aesthetic there, filtered like that. A sense of romanticism that does sort of move away when you get the wind turbines and the whoosh coming, which is kind of pepped up and sort of mixed with in terms of the oscillations of certain synths and stuff like that, where like we work with LFOs and add noise textures and stuff like that, and amongst the stacking of things in terms of octaves. But what I think is really cool about it is that even with like a lack of vocals and like lead elements, they're explicitly telling you what is going on. Maybe not, they have instruments there that aren't even necessarily melodic or harmonic. They're more simply tracks where they have a sound or a texture or timbre that communicates the mood to you without needing to sort of like, again, like explain it to you. You can feel that and envisage what's going on there. You can hear the journey of things moving in the stereo field. You can hear the clicking of things as well. You can hear the door knocking and everything like that. And I love when people put the Foley, the sounds of real life things into their music. It creates a bigger experience there. It's just really clever. Because with audio, you can do literally whatever you want with a waveform. You know, you don't just have to do vocals as a lead or even an instrumental lead or even go between them. There's more you can do. And again, it's just testament to their ability to storytelling that they didn't need to rely on vocals too much, and they can have the knocking and the stepping and stuff to kind of help the listener figure out stuff. But ultimately, again, even if there are occasional kind of like very lightly kind of like moody elements there, most of this was more about either the lack of how unsettling the bars or distortion or kind of flickering of things were. You had occasional knocks and doofs and stuff like that, and even with Everything Disappears, it's like the vocals become mutated because of how we slow the sample as well in that track there. It's almost like everything that is beautiful comes undone. There are all these inferences you can take away from the lack of obvious storytelling that kind of add a sense of sophistication to this music. I think you can either sort of like go for the complete vibe check and not sort of like think about it too much, or sort of guess and have fun doing so, even though you feel for the position that they're in. Because thematically, this track, even though there's some occasional sort of like extended majors, there are a fair few tracks which rely on that diminished within this. And I think even, removing the diminished, which is like a super minor chord, it's also just the kind of harshness of some of those elements within the track, within this EP, should I say, that really kind of elevates it and tells you more than they could maybe with a chord or a bass line. But there are occasional subleads. There's a lot of, probably there's things I haven't mentioned because I'm trying to sort of like provide my overall thoughts as well, as opposed to sort of like going through each track individually, because each track already has their own sort of like mini conclusion. But effectively, you just have quite a unique sounding EP that the diminished make sense, the extensions make sense with a kind of bittersweet kind of mood to it there. Looking back at our memories there, I just think it's a kind of intimate journey that we're going with MaeBeaNot throughout this. And it just, again, I mentioned that do great work, with like horror film scores and stuff like that. I think that this is kind of like a little bit of a horror film in the sense that we don't get that happy ending that we wanted. It's left ambivalent, it's left ambiguous, And I think that's ironically something of like, it's quite contiguous with MaeBeaNot's work, that they continue like that there aren't a lot of resolutions. But ultimately, studio recording, mixing and mastering wise, just the way that things are filtered, the way that the effects are added, the way we sort of add emphasis on certain frequency spectrums and amend the intensity of the different ranges of like tone knobs or other sort of like fun tools there to affect the listener's experience with the individual instruments, let alone how we structure and layer them within the frequency spectrum, the use of distortion and the use of reverb change and everything like that, use of filtering to like make them smaller or bigger, the way that we also flesh out the stereo field. It's not just the panning or automation and panning of elements there. The tracks sound huge, especially near the end, where they're kind of longing for days never came kind of like expanded there really neatly. And you're just left in a position where you have to appreciate the immense amount of dynamic range to those tracks, as well as the fact that when there were vocal takes or sampled elements and stuff like that or Foley there, they fit into the mix really neatly as well. There was never a moment where it felt alien. They've got their fundamentals handled and more in post, as well as the other elements there. So there's no applicable constructive critique from me. It's just another really solid release from MaeBeaNot. They've definitely got their own sort of niche that they work within. They're very comfortable with their style at this point. I feel like this in general, these 6 tracks are a natural progression of what they have been communicating within the music and what they've been presenting so far. On one hand, I am sad as a human being that they are going through music that inspires them to do this, but at the same time, I nonetheless appreciate genuinely that they are putting themselves out there like this. I wish them all the best of luck in future with their musical endeavors, and thank you very much for watching my review of these tracks from an act named MaeBeaNot off of the Involuntary Recollections digital album. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, please go show them some love via their various social medias, as well as YouTube and Bandcamp, and stay cool and stay safe, and please remember to support your local musicians and artists at this point in time, as we need the help more than ever with the crazy stuff going on in the world, and I will catch you in the next SB Reacts. Spiderhands out.